The deadly pact of 1831 shattered more than just a family. It destroyed an entire Cuban dynasty through a shocking exchange of newborns between a countess and her slave. The secret agreement would rewrite bloodlines and alter the course of generations to come. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. March 1831 brought unusually violent storms to the Cuban coast, with thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of San Rafael Plantation. The grand estate, with its imposing white columns and sprawling sugar fields, stood as a monument to Spanish colonial wealth in Matanzas. Inside the marble-floored mansion, servants scurried through corridors, their whispers urgent as they carried linens and heated water to the master bedroom. Countess Isabella de Montemayor clutched the bedposts as another contraction tore through her body, her normally composed face contorted in agony, sweat plastering her dark hair against her pale skin. "The heir cannot die," she gasped between pains, her eyes wild with fear. The midwife, Doña Felicia, worked frantically, her experienced hands betraying concern as she noted the weakening heartbeat of the child struggling to enter the world. Less than 500 yards away, in the cramped, smoke-filled galera where the enslaved lived, Amara Akefer bit down on a strip of cloth to muffle her cries. The Yoruba healer, respected among her people for her knowledge of herbs and spirits, now found herself at the mercy of the same natural forces she had helped others navigate. Her child came quickly, strong and robust despite the squalid conditions, his first cry powerful enough to be heard over the storm. "A boy," whispered the elderly woman assisting her, eyes darting nervously toward the door. "A strong boy, but the overseers." She didn't need to finish. Both women knew what happened to strong male children born into bondage. Harder work, closer scrutiny, shorter lives. Lightning illuminated the plantation as Don Rodrigo de Montemayor paced outside his wife's chambers, the proud plantation owner's face etched with worry. The family name required an heir, and this might be Isabella's last chance after 3 previous losses. When dawn finally broke, fate intervened in the form of a desperate idea. Doña Felicia, moving between both births, saw opportunity in tragedy. She whispered to Isabella about the dying infant in her arms and the healthy child born to the Yoruba woman. The countess, delirious with pain and fear of her husband's wrath, locked eyes with Amara when the healer was summoned to help with a remedy. In that moment, without words, a maternal understanding passed between them. Amara, seeing a chance for her son to escape the brutality of enslavement, gave an almost imperceptible nod. Isabella, desperate to present her husband with the heir he demanded, made her choice. The swaddling cloths were exchanged in the chaos of the storm's final hours. By morning, Countess Isabella de Montemayor proudly presented Carlos Rodrigo de Montemayor to her husband, while in the galera, Amara Akefer quietly mourned as she held a weakening infant now called Tomas. The pact made that stormy night would forever alter the course of both families and ultimately the plantation itself. The morning after the storm dawned with an eerie stillness over San Rafael Plantation. The torrential rains had ceased, leaving behind a heavy mist that clung to the sugar fields like a shroud of secrets. Inside the marble halls of the great house, servants moved silently, exchanging knowing glances as they prepared for the day's announcement. Countess Isabella de Montemayor sat propped against silk pillows, her face pale but composed as she cradled the robust infant in her arms. The boy, now wrapped in the finest Spanish lace, showed no signs of the weakness that had terrified her hours before. When Don Rodrigo entered the chamber, Isabella presented him with what appeared to be his son and heir. "Carlos Rodrigo de Montemayor," she announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Our dynasty is secured." Don Rodrigo beamed with pride, unaware that the child in his wife's arms had been born not in this opulent bedroom, but in the cramped galera where the enslaved lived. He kissed Isabella's forehead, blind to the shadow that crossed her eyes. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, Amara Akefer sat motionless on her thin pallet, her empty arms aching. The Yoruba healer had given away her strong, healthy son to save him from a life of bondage. In return, she now nursed the frail infant born to the countess, registered simply as Tomas, another name in the plantation's inventory of human property. "He will live," Amara whispered to the child, her tears falling onto his tiny face. "Both our sons will live." Doña Felicia, the midwife who had witnessed the desperate exchange, stood nervously in Don Rodrigo's study later that morning. The plantation owner counted out 30 pesos oro into her weathered palm. "For your discretion," he said, though he himself knew nothing of the women's pact. He believed the payment was merely for her services during a difficult birth. Isabella had been more direct with the midwife in the chaotic moments after the exchange. "Speak of this night to anyone," the countess had hissed, "and you will find yourself exiled from every decent household in Cuba." The midwife nodded, pocketing the coins. She understood the weight of the secret she now carried. As bells rang out across San Rafael announcing the birth of the Montemayor heir, Isabella gazed out her window toward the fields. Amara looked up from her work at the same moment, and though separated by distance and station, both women felt the invisible thread that now bound them together. The foundations of the great plantation had always been built on sugar, blood, and suffering. Now they rested on something even more precarious, a lie that would haunt every waking moment for the women involved, a secret pact that would one day bring the entire dynasty crashing down. Carlos Rodrigo de Montemayor's childhood unfolded like a tapestry of privilege within the marble halls of San Rafael. By age 7, his days began with the aroma of freshly baked pan cubano and ended with servants turning down silk sheets in his private chamber. Don Rodrigo spared no expense for his heir, hiring the finest tutors from Havana who filled the boy's head with Latin, mathematics, and European history. "A Montemayor must excel in all things," his father would declare, watching with pride as Carlos mastered the violin, his small fingers dancing across strings imported from Italy. The plantation owner would parade his son through Matanza society, displaying him like a prized possession at gatherings where other colonial families nodded approvingly at the boy's perfect posture and impeccable manners. Countess Isabella observed her son with a mixture of adoration and hidden guilt. She lavished him with affection, perhaps compensating for the truth that gnawed at her conscience. The boy grew accustomed to her sudden embraces, the way she would sometimes stare at him with tears threatening to spill. "You are destined for greatness," she would whisper, smoothing his dark curls with trembling hands. Yet beneath his polished exterior, Carlos harbored a restless curiosity that his European education couldn't satisfy. While his tutors lectured about Spanish kings, his attention often drifted to the window, where he could glimpse the distant figures of field workers moving in rhythm under the Cuban sun. At night, when the main house fell silent, Carlos would sometimes slip to his balcony, drawn by the faint sounds of bembe drums. The rhythms called to something deep within him, a connection he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. Once he ventured closer than permitted to the workers' quarters, hiding behind a grove of royal palms as Amara led a circle of people in movements that seemed both prayer and dance. The healer moved with such authority and grace that Carlos found himself mesmerized. Though he'd been taught that the enslaved people were inferior, something about Amara commanded respect. He noticed how others deferred to her, how even in servitude she carried herself with dignity. Don Rodrigo caught him watching once and dragged him back to the house by his collar. "Those rituals are pagan nonsense," he scolded. "A Montemayor does not concern himself with the superstitions of slaves." Yet Carlos couldn't forget what he'd seen. In his 10th year, when his father sent him to the prestigious Colegio de Belén in Havana, he carried these forbidden memories alongside his leather-bound books and monogrammed trunks. While Jesuit priests molded him for a future among Cuba's elite, his dreams remained filled with drumbeats and the mysterious woman who, unknown to him, had given him life. While Carlos Rodrigo enjoyed the privileges of the main house, Tomas lived a starkly different reality in the shadow of San Rafael's imposing sugar mill. Amara Aquifer raised her son, though not of her blood, among the hundreds of enslaved souls who toiled under the merciless Cuban sun. Their home was a cramped galera, a long barracks where families were crowded together with barely enough space to lie down at night. From dawn until dusk, Tomas learned the brutal rhythms of plantation life. His small hands quickly grew calloused from cutting cane, his back familiar with the weight of heavy loads. The overseers were quick with their whips, especially toward a boy who carried himself with unusual dignity. "Keep your eyes down, but your spirit up," Amara would whisper to him each morning, checking his hands for cuts that she would later treat with healing herbs gathered in secret. The healer was respected among the enslaved community, her knowledge offering rare moments of relief in their harsh existence. At night, when the work was done and the overseers retreated to their quarters, Amara would gather Tomas and other children around her. In hushed tones, she shared stories of the Orishas, Yemaya of the ocean, Shango of thunder, Oshun of rivers and love. "These are the powers that watched over our ancestors," he explained, "and they watch over us still." The boy absorbed these lessons eagerly, finding strength in the heritage his mother preserved despite everything that had been taken from them. He learned to recognize the hidden Yoruba symbols carved discreetly into wooden posts and tools, silent messages of resistance and remembrance. By the age of 10, Tomas had developed a reputation among the enslaved population. When an elderly man collapsed in the fields, it was the young boy who created a distraction so others could carry him to safety. When food rations were cut, he devised clever ways to share what little they had, ensuring no child went entirely hungry. "That one has the heart of a king," Father Esteban once remarked quietly to Amara after observing Tomas organize the children to help an injured woman. The priest occasionally visited the quarters, ostensibly to offer spiritual guidance, but often bringing small comforts and medical supplies. What neither Tomas nor anyone else suspected was the truth flowing through his veins, that the noble bearing that drew both admiration from his peers and dangerous attention from overseers came from his true parentage. He was, by birth, the son of Isabella and Don Rodrigo de Montemayor, heir to the very plantation that enslaved him. Amara watched her son with a mixture of pride and fear. Pride in the young man he was becoming, resourceful, compassionate, and strong. Fear for what might happen if his natural leadership and courage drew too much notice from those with power over their lives. She could never tell him the truth, but she could arm him with something perhaps more valuable: the unbroken spirit of his Yoruba heritage. The forbidden meeting happened on a sweltering afternoon when Carlos Rodrigo de Montemayor, aged 9, ventured beyond the manicured gardens of San Rafael. Seeking relief from his violin lessons, the young heir followed the sound of rushing water until he reached the plantation's riverbank, where the boundary between privilege and servitude blurred among the ceiba trees. It was there he first encountered Tomas, a boy his same age but worlds apart. The enslaved child was collecting clay for Amara's healing mixtures when he spotted Carlos watching him. Both boys froze, taught to fear such encounters, yet neither fled. "What are you making?" Carlos finally asked, curiosity overpowering caution. Tomas hesitated before explaining the symbols he was drawing in the mud, representations of Orishas that his mother had taught him. Carlos sat beside him, fascinated, and offered to show how these same shapes could become Spanish letters. From that day forward, they created their own secret world. Carlos would slip away from his lessons, bringing scraps of paper and tales from his European books. "The stories are like yours," he told Tomas once. But the heroes wear different clothes and speak different words. Tomas, in turn, revealed hidden pathways through the plantation, narrow trails between cane fields where overseers rarely ventured. He taught the air how to identify birds by their calls and which plants could heal a fever. The knowledge Amara had instilled in him flowed naturally to his friend. "My mother says these symbols protect us," Tomas explained one afternoon, tracing Yoruba patterns in the dirt. "They remember who we are, even when others try to make us forget." Carlos nodded solemnly. "I'll remember them too." Their meetings became elaborate escapes, planned with childish precision. Carlos would claim to be studying, while Tomas volunteered for water-carrying duties. They created signals. 3 stones stacked by the river meant it was safe to meet. 2 meant danger. Yet reality always loomed. Once, hearing an overseer's voice, Tomas pushed Carlos into the bushes and immediately dropped to his knees, pretending to wash clothes in the river. The young heir watched, stomach twisting, as his friend was berated for laziness. "Why must you bow to him?" Carlos asked afterward, his privileged upbringing evident in his confusion. Tomas looked at him with eyes far older than his years. "Because I wish to live to see tomorrow's sun." The friendship flourished despite these shadows, nurtured by a connection neither boy could name. What they didn't understand was the blood they shared, not through their veins, but through the women who had exchanged their fates that stormy night years before. In their innocent alliance lay the seeds of a rebellion that would one day shake San Rafael to its foundations. Countess Isabella de Montemayor stood at the window of her second-floor chamber, her fingers clutching the heavy brocade curtain as she watched the enslaved workers in the fields. Her eyes followed one figure in particular, Tomas. Though he labored under the merciless Cuban sun, there was a dignity in his posture that reminded her painfully of her husband. Every day for 5 years, she had observed her biological son from a distance, noting how he'd grown tall and strong. When the overseer raised his whip toward Tomas for pausing to help an elderly worker, Isabella felt her heart constrict. Before she realized what she was doing, she had dispatched a house servant with instructions to summon the overseer immediately. "The boy shows leadership qualities," she told the confused man minutes later in her sitting room. "I believe he could be more valuable supervising the water distribution than cutting cane. See to it." This wasn't the first time she had intervened. Small mercies, lighter work assignments, extra rations, protection from the most brutal punishments, all arranged through careful suggestions and manufactured reasons. The household staff had begun to whisper. Why did the countess concern herself with one enslaved boy? Some speculated impropriety, others simple Christian charity. At night, Isabella paced her chambers, sleep evading her. The weight of her deception pressed upon her chest like a physical burden. She would stand before her ornate mirror, searching her reflection for signs of the woman who had made such a terrible bargain. Sometimes she imagined she could see Thomas's eyes staring back at her from her own face. "You seem troubled, my dear," Don Rodrigo remarked one evening as they dined alone in the grand hall. "Perhaps Father Alvarez should visit more frequently for your confessions." Isabella nodded, grateful for the suggestion while dreading the implications. Her visits to the plantation chapel had increased threefold in recent months. She spent hours on her knees, begging forgiveness for a sin she could never confess. The priest, puzzled by her vague admissions of maternal failure, prescribed endless rosaries and charitable acts. She fulfilled these penances meticulously, donating to orphanages and matanzas and attending to sick children. Yet no amount of prayer could quiet the voice inside that whispered, "He is your son." Sometimes, when passing Amara in the courtyard, their eyes would meet in silent acknowledgement of their shared secret. In those fleeting moments, Isabella felt both gratitude and resentment toward the Yoruba woman who raised her flesh and blood while she mothered Amara's son. "The countess grows strange," the house servants murmured when they thought no one could hear. She weeps in her chambers and speaks to herself in the garden. But what they couldn't understand was the impossible divide that tore at her. Between the aristocratic matriarch who presided over lavish dinners in her dining hall and the broken mother who watched her true son toil under another woman's care. The night air hung thick with humidity as Amara Akafer moved silently between the galeras. Her fingers trailed along worn wooden walls, leaving behind small markings only the initiated would recognize. Symbols of protection, of gathering, of resistance. What began as whispered prayers had grown into something more powerful. Under moonlight, behind the sugar mill where overseers rarely ventured after dark, Amara had created a sanctuary. Here she taught the old ways, the rituals of Yoruba ancestors that plantation owners had tried to erase. Her knowledge of medicinal herbs treated wounds from overseer whips, eased childbirth pains, and strengthened those weakened by brutal labor. "The Orishas speak through the leaves," she would say, crushing dried herbs between her palms. The enslaved workers of San Rafael gathered around her, drawn to her quiet authority. They called her mother, regardless of age, for she nurtured their spirits when their bodies were broken. Word of her healing spread beyond San Rafael. Enslaved people from neighboring plantations would risk severe punishment to seek her wisdom. Some came with festering wounds, others with broken spirits, all left with something they had lost: dignity, hope, or simply the will to survive another day. Yet beneath her growing influence lay a constant, gnawing fear. Each time she looked at Carlos Rodrigo in the main house, watching him from afar as he practiced violin or rode his horse across the estate, her heart constricted. The boy carried her blood, her features softened by privilege, and Tomas, working in the fields, bore the aristocratic brow of Countess Isabella, though none dared mention the resemblance. "Your hands have your grandmother's strength," Amara whispered to Tomas one evening as she treated his blistered palms with aloe. She could never tell him more, but she poured her love into these small moments, teaching him everything she knew about survival. The pact with Isabella haunted her dreams. Some nights Amara imagined soldiers dragging her away, separating her from both sons, the one she birthed and the one she raised. Other nights she dreamed of Don Rodrigo discovering the truth, his rage destroying everything. Despite these fears, Amara built a network. Messages traveled through songs sung in the fields, through patterns woven into baskets, through stories told around evening fires. Information about sympathetic whites, escape routes, and plantation vulnerabilities passed through her hands. "We may be in chains," she told her trusted circle, "but our spirits remain free." As her influence grew, so did her caution. Amara knew that her power existed only in the shadows. One misstep, one betrayal, and everything would collapse. Not just her leadership, but the fragile protection she maintained over Tomas and the distant watch she kept over Carlos. The deadly pact that had saved both children might yet destroy them all. Don Rodrigo de Montemayor paced the marble corridors of San Rafael with mounting unease. The plantation's success had once been enough, the sugar flowing like golden rivers, the envy of Matanzas society. But now, a different obsession consumed him. He found himself watching his son with critical eyes, searching for reflections of himself in the boy's features and mannerisms. "The way Carlos holds himself," he muttered to his most trusted overseer one evening after too many glasses of rum. "Have you noticed it? Nothing like my father or any Montemayor before him." What troubled the plantation owner most were the similarities he couldn't ignore between the heir and Amara Akafer. The healer's graceful movements seemed mirrored in his son's gait. The tilt of Carlos Rodrigo's head when listening, identical to the Yoruba woman's. Even the boy's intuitive understanding of rhythm, displayed during his violin lessons, felt foreign to Spanish blood. Meanwhile, Tomas, though dressed in rough cotton and bearing the calluses of labor, carried himself with an inexplicable dignity that both fascinated and infuriated Don Rodrigo. The enslaved boy's eyes, intelligent and unflinching, reminded him too much of Isabella's family. "That one needs extra watching," he instructed the overseers. "There's something dangerous in him." His suspicions poisoned his marriage. At dinner, he would study his wife's face for signs of deception, interpreting her every glance toward the quarters as evidence of some hidden truth. "You spend too much time with that healer," he accused Isabella one night. "What business does a countess have with slaves beyond giving orders?" The countess withdrew further into herself with each confrontation, seeking refuge in prayer and the company of Doña Felicia, whose nervous glances only fueled Rodrigo's paranoia. His obsession with Amara grew more complex. He found reasons to summon her to the main house, minor ailments requiring her herbal knowledge, only to dismiss her with cruel words after lingering too long on her features, searching for answers. "She bewitches this household," he confided to Father Esteban during confession. "I dream of burning every trace of Africa from this plantation." The priest offered gentle counsel, but Don Rodrigo's mind was set. He increased punishments for any enslaved person caught practicing Yoruba traditions, ordered the burning of drums, and forbade gatherings after sundown. Yet the more he tightened his grip, the more the estate seemed to slip from his control. Carlos grew distant, Isabella retreated into silence, and whispers spread through the quarters. The weight of unspoken truths hung heavy over San Rafael, and Don Rodrigo, heir to one of Cuba's greatest fortunes, found himself a stranger in his own home, tormented by questions he dared not fully form. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across San Rafael's courtyard when Don Rodrigo de Montemayor discovered his son and the enslaved boy beneath the mango tree. Carlos had been teaching Tomás to read from a tattered book of Spanish poetry, their heads bent together in concentration. For years they had managed to keep their friendship hidden, meeting in forgotten corners of the plantation where even the most vigilant overseers rarely ventured. "What is the meaning of this?" Don Rodrigo's voice cracked like a whip. The plantation owner's face contorted with rage, veins bulging at his temples as he snatched the book from Tomás's hands. "You dare to teach this slave to read?" Carlos rose to his feet. "Father, please. Tomás is intelligent. He deserves silence." The master of San Rafael struck his son across the face, sending the boy stumbling backward. "You dishonor our name by consorting with slaves. Have I taught you nothing of your position?" Tomás remained kneeling, eyes fixed on the ground, his body tense with the practiced stillness that meant survival. Yet something in his posture, a certain dignity that seemed almost innate, only fueled Don Rodrigo's fury. "Take him to the cane fields," he ordered the overseer, who had hurried to his side. "Let him feel the weight of real work until he forgets these ridiculous notions." "No!" Carlos lunged forward, but two house servants restrained him on his father's command. That evening, Amara watched helplessly as her son was marched toward the distant fields where the most brutal labor awaited. Her hands trembled as she prepared healing herbs, knowing what the cane would do to his unaccustomed body. The healer caught Isabella's eye across the courtyard, a fleeting moment of shared anguish before the countess turned away, powerless against her husband's decree. Within a week, Carlos found himself in a carriage bound for Havana, enrolled in the prestigious Colegio de Belén. "You will become a proper gentleman," Don Rodrigo informed him coldly, "and forget these childish rebellions." The separation tore through both young men like a hurricane. Carlos, surrounded by the sons of Cuba's elite, found himself suffocating in starched collars and rigid etiquette. Each night, he dreamed of the plantation's hidden paths and the friend who had shown them to him. Tomás, meanwhile, endured the merciless routine of the cane fields, cutting from dawn until dusk, his hands blistered and bleeding. Yet even as his body suffered, his mind clung to the words Carlos had taught him, reciting poems silently as he swung the machete. Father Esteban, seeing the boy's suffering, smuggled small scraps of paper to him, ensuring the fragile flame of literacy wouldn't die. "Knowledge cannot be taken from you," the priest whispered during Sunday services. Two paths diverged that day, one leading to Havana's intellectual circles, the other deeper into plantation brutality. Neither boy could have imagined how these separate journeys would eventually converge to shake the very foundations of San Rafael. The marble halls of the Colegio de Belén in Havana felt nothing like San Rafael to Carlos Rodrigo de Montemayor. Here, among the sons of Cuba's elite, he found himself drawn to a different kind of education, one that occurred after lectures ended, in hushed conversations beneath mango trees in the courtyard. "The system that enriches our families is built on suffering," whispered Eduardo, the son of a sugar merchant, as their small circle of confidants nodded solemnly. Carlos had never heard such talk at home, where plantation life was simply the natural order of things. Yet these words resonated with memories of Tomas and the others at San Rafael, their dignity despite their chains. The young heir found himself spending evenings in literary salons, where poets and philosophers cautiously debated ideas from Europe and the Americas. It was at one such gathering that he first saw Lucia Zamora. The free mixed-race woman stood confidently addressing the room, her words cutting through pretense with surgical precision. "You speak of liberty while your family's wealth flows from the backs of the enslaved," she challenged. Her gaze met Carlos's, and he felt exposed, as if she could see the plantation dust still clinging to his soul. In the weeks that followed, Carlos sought her out, initially to defend his family's honor, but their conversations transformed into something else entirely. Lucia introduced him to abolitionist writings smuggled from abroad, and to communities of free people of color who maintained their dignity despite Spanish colonial rule. "Your conscience troubles you," she observed one evening, as they walked along Havana's seawall. "I see it in your eyes when we speak of San Rafael." The young man could not deny it. At night, his dreams were filled with bembe drums and Tomas's laughter by the river. He would wake with Yoruba melodies on his lips, songs he shouldn't know, but somehow did. Meanwhile, letters from his mother arrived weekly, filled with news of his impending engagement to Inés de la Vega, daughter of a Spanish aristocrat. "A perfect match," Isabella wrote, "to strengthen our position in society." Each letter felt like another brick in a wall being built around his future. During a family visit to Havana, Don Rodrigo presented Carlos to Inés at the governor's ball. She was everything a young Spanish nobleman could desire: beautiful, well-educated, and impeccably connected. Yet as they danced beneath crystal chandeliers, Carlos found himself thinking of Lucia's challenging questions and fierce intellect. "You seem distant," Inés remarked, her fan fluttering nervously. "Forgive me," he replied. "My thoughts were elsewhere." That night, staring at the ceiling of his dormitory, Carlos realized that two paths stretched before him, one paved with privilege and obligation, the other with dangerous truth and justice. The plantation heir was becoming something his father never intended, a young man with revolutionary thoughts. While Carlos Rodrigo received his education in Havana's prestigious halls, Tomas forged his own path at San Rafael. The brutal labor in the cane fields had hardened his body, but it was his spirit that truly flourished. In the shadows of dusk, after backbreaking days, Tomas would gather small groups of trusted companions near the edge of the galera. "Our ancestors were kings and queens," he would whisper, recounting the tales Amara had taught him of Yoruba royalty and warriors who never surrendered. His words painted vivid images of dignity that transcended their current bondage, offering something many had lost: pride. Father Esteban, a Spanish priest with unusually progressive views, had noticed Tomas's natural intelligence during Sunday services. Against all plantation rules, the clergyman began smuggling books to Amara, who passed them to her son. Under moonlight, Tomas traced letters with his finger, mouthing words until they became familiar friends. Knowledge is the one thing they cannot strip from you once you possess it, the priest had told him during a clandestine meeting behind the chapel. By 16, Tomás could read and write better than many free Cubans. Amara watched her son with a mixture of pride and fear. The healer recognized in him the noble blood that secretly flowed through his veins, the same Montemayor determination that built San Rafael, now channeled toward its potential undoing. She taught him to mask his intelligence before Don Rodrigo, whose paranoid gaze often lingered on the young man with unsettling intensity. "There's something about that boy," the plantation owner would mutter to overseers. "Watch him carefully." Despite the scrutiny, Tomás's influence grew. When an overseer beat an elderly man for dropping a sugarcane bundle, Tomás organized a silent work slowdown that cost the plantation a day's production. When punishment was threatened, no single person could be blamed. His strategic mind proved valuable in other ways. He developed a system of drum patterns and field songs that conveyed messages across the plantation without raising suspicion. Through these coded communications, news of rebellions elsewhere in Cuba spread, kindling hope. "Freedom isn't given," Tomás told his growing circle of confidants. "It must be taken." By 18, he had established a network of trusted allies across neighboring plantations. Connected through the market days when slaves from different estates could briefly mingle, whispers of his name traveled through Matanzas province, not as the biological son of Isabella de Montemayor, but as something perhaps more powerful, a symbol of resistance. Beneath San Rafael's opulent facade, with its marble columns and manicured gardens, a current of change was building. And at its center stood Tomás, the true heir of the estate, though neither he nor those who followed him yet knew the full truth of his bloodline. The summer of 1846 brought Carlos Rodrigo de Montemayor back to San Rafael, his carriage rolling through gates that seemed smaller than in his memories. Havana had changed him. The intellectual circles, the whispered conversations about freedom, and especially his relationship with Lucia had awakened something fierce within him. The plantation appeared unchanged, the marble columns still gleaming, the cane fields still stretching toward the horizon. But Carlos saw it differently now, each luxury tainted by the knowledge of its true cost. He found Amara grinding herbs behind the kitchen house, her hands working methodically while her eyes remained alert. When she looked up at him, something passed between them, a recognition beyond words. "You've learned much in the capital," she said simply, studying his face. Carlos nodded. "About justice, about what happens here." He hesitated. "About who I might truly be." The healer's hands stilled. She didn't confirm his suspicions, but her silence spoke volumes. Instead, she mentioned that Tomás had become a man respected among their people, and that perhaps Carlos should visit the fields at dusk. That evening, beneath a mango tree at the property's edge, the brothers reunited. Tomás had grown lean and strong, his bearing dignified despite the scars visible on his shoulders. The biological son of the Count and Countess carried himself with natural nobility, even in tattered clothing. "The festival of the Virgin approaches," Tomás said, after they had spoken of safer matters. "The overseers drink heavily. The gates remain open for visitors." Carlos leaned closer. "In Havana, there are men and women willing to help. Free people of color, intellectuals who believe slavery must end." Over the following weeks, their plan took shape. Messages traveled between San Rafael and neighboring plantations through Amara's network of herb gatherers. Father Esteban provided sanctuary for their meetings under the guise of catechism classes. Carlos used his position to gather information about guard rotations and weapon storage. The brothers' strategy was ambitious. During the festival of the Virgin de las Mercedes, when celebration would provide cover, they would coordinate an uprising across 3 plantations. Carlos had arranged for sympathizers in Matanzas to provide boats for escape to the eastern provinces. "This is not just about freedom," Tomás told the growing circle of conspirators one night. "It's about justice, about becoming who we truly are. What neither brother could see was the shadow that fell across the doorway during one of their meetings, a young boy listening, his heart pounding with the weight of what he'd heard and what it might mean for his own future if he shared this dangerous secret with Don Rodrigo. As the festival approached, the air grew heavy with more than summer heat. It carried the electricity of coming change, the whispered prayers of those who dared to hope, and the invisible threads of betrayal already beginning to unravel their carefully laid plans. The night of the rebellion arrived under a sky so dark it seemed to swallow the stars. Tomás and Carlos Rodrigo had spent weeks coordinating their plan, synchronizing movements between the enslaved at San Rafael and sympathizers in neighboring plantations. The Virgin de las Mercedes festival provided perfect cover. Guards would be distracted, and the drumming would mask their signals. But betrayal came from within. Mateo, a 12-year-old boy who cleaned the main house, had overheard fragments of their whispers, terrified of the violence that might follow and hoping to earn protection for his ailing mother. He approached Don Rodrigo de Montemayor with trembling lips and downcast eyes. "Speak, boy," the plantation owner demanded, his face hardening as Mateo revealed what he knew. Within hours, Don Rodrigo had summoned armed guards from Matanzas. They arrived silently, positioning themselves around the estate like predators waiting for prey. The patriarch's paranoia, which had festered for years, now found its justification. When Tomás gave the first signal, a specific pattern played on the bembe drums. The response was not the coordinated uprising they had planned, but a hail of gunfire. Guards emerged from shadows, torches illuminating their merciless faces as they charged into the gathered crowd. "Run!" Tomás shouted to his comrades, but many were already falling. The courtyard became a battlefield, machetes against rifles, desperation against trained violence. Carlos Rodrigo, who had been waiting near the chapel to lead a group toward the main house, watched in horror as his carefully constructed plan collapsed. He rushed toward the chaos, searching frantically for Tomás among the struggling figures. He found his brother confronting 3 guards, fighting with the dignity of the royal blood that secretly ran in his veins. "Behind you!" Carlos screamed, but his warning came too late. A guard's bayonet pierced Tomás's side, and he crumpled to the ground. Carlos fought his way to Tomás, cradling him as blood soaked through his shirt. Their eyes met in shared understanding. The revolution they had dreamed of was dying alongside dozens of others. "Go," Tomás whispered, pushing Carlos away with the last of his strength. "You must survive to tell our story." Amara appeared through the smoke, her face a mask of terror as she saw her son, the one she had raised, not birthed, lying wounded. She knelt beside him, already murmuring Yoruba prayers. "Save him," Carlos begged, tears streaming down his face. "Go now," she commanded, her healer's hands already working to stem the bleeding. "They will kill you if they find you here." With a final anguished look at Tomás, Carlos fled into the darkness, pursued by shouts and distant gunfire. Behind him, San Rafael burned, not with the flames of liberation they had planned, but with the fires of retribution. His hopes, like the rebellion itself, lay in ruins. The plantation chapel stood silent, but for the labored breathing of Tomás. Blood seeped through hastily applied bandages, staining the simple altar cloth crimson. Amara Akafer knelt beside her son, her hands trembling as they worked herbs into his wounds, a futile effort against the inevitable. With a sudden, fierce determination, she rose to her feet. "Bring them," she commanded a young boy. "Bring them all." Within minutes, the chapel filled with the household. Don Rodrigo de Montemayor entered first, his face contorted with rage at being summoned by a slave. Countess Isabella followed, her eyes immediately finding Tomás's broken form, a strangled sob escaping her lips. Carlos Rodrigo rushed in last, disheveled and wild-eyed from his narrow escape. "You will all hear the truth before he passes," Amara declared, her voice carrying a power that silenced even Don Rodrigo's brewing protest. "This dying boy is not my son by birth." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered servants and overseers. 18 years ago, during the Great Storm, the Countess and I both gave birth, she continued, standing tall despite the danger of her words. "Her child, her true child, lies before you now. And yours, my lady," she turned to Isabella, "stands there, raised as your heir." Don Rodrigo staggered backward as if struck. "Impossible," he whispered. Yet his eyes darted between Carlos and Tomas, suddenly seeing what had always been before him. The subtle similarities between Tomas and Isabella, the unmistakable echoes of Amara in Carlos's expressions. "We exchanged them," Amara pressed on. "She to save her position, I to save my child from the fate you see before you now. Yet fate has found us anyway." Isabella crumpled to her knees beside Tomas, touching his face with trembling fingers. "My son," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My firstborn." Carlos moved forward as if in a trance, kneeling opposite Isabella. "Brother," he said simply, taking Tomas's hand. The dying young man's eyes fluttered open, recognition and understanding dawning in them. "I always knew," Tomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something in me always knew." Don Rodrigo's face transformed from shock to murderous fury. "This treachery," he hissed, "this unholy deception." "Was an act of love," Father Esteban interrupted, stepping from the shadows where he had been administering last rites. Two mothers protecting their sons the only way they could. As Tomas drew his final breath, the truth hung in the chapel air, heavier than incense, more binding than prayer. The Montemayor dynasty, built on bloodlines and privilege, shattered in that moment, revealing itself to be nothing more than a house of cards built on shifting sand. Don Rodrigo de Montemayor stood rigid in his study, his face contorted with disgust as he stared at Carlos. "You are no son of mine," he spat, each word dripping with venom. "The blood of slaves runs through your veins. You will leave for Spain on the next vessel and never return to Cuban soil." Carlos looked around the room where he had spent countless hours learning to be a gentleman. Now it felt like a prison from which he was being released. He was stripped of everything, his name, his inheritance, his identity, yet somehow felt freer than ever before. "I accept my exile," he said quietly, "but I will not accept your hatred. Blood means nothing compared to the truth we now know." The patriarch turned away, unable to bear the sight of the young man he had raised as his heir. Within 3 days, Carlos departed San Rafael with only a small trunk of possessions. The carriage ride to the harbor was silent, the familiar landscape of sugar fields passing by like a fading dream. Meanwhile, Countess Isabella, her elegant composure finally shattered, sought refuge in the convent of Santa Clara in Havana. The marble halls and gilded chambers of San Rafael had become unbearable, haunted by the ghosts of her decisions. Each night, she knelt on the hard stone floor of her sparse cell until her knees bled, begging forgiveness from God and from Tomas. "I have destroyed 2 sons," she whispered to the Mother Superior, who knew nothing of her true sin. "One by birth and one by choice." The nuns watched with curiosity as the once proud aristocrat scrubbed floors and tended to the sick with desperate fervor. Her dowry, secretly divided, found its way into the hands of those working against the institution that had destroyed her family. At San Rafael, Amara faced her own reckoning. The overseers demanded her execution for her role in the deception and the failed rebellion. She stood in the courtyard, head high, prepared to join Tomas in death when Father Esteban intervened. "This woman has suffered enough," the priest declared. "Her punishment will be to live with what she has done." Don Rodrigo, broken and seeking someone to blame, reluctantly agreed, but banished her to a small hut at the edge of the plantation. There, Amara lived in enforced isolation, forbidden to practice her healing or perform rituals. Yet in the darkness of night, she still whispered Yoruba prayers for both her sons, one sailing toward a distant shore, one resting in unmarked earth. 3 lives torn apart by a single night's decision, scattered like leaves in a hurricane, each carrying a piece of the truth that had destroyed a dynasty. The once magnificent San Rafael plantation lay in ruins. Where elegant sugarcane had once swayed in orderly rows, now only charred stumps remained. A testament to the violence that had erupted. The grand marble halls of the Montemayor estate stood eerily silent, windows broken and curtains billowing like ghosts in the Caribbean breeze. The workers who hadn't perished in the uprising had scattered, some fleeing to neighboring plantations, others making the dangerous journey to Havana in search of new lives. In the elegant salons of Havana, the Montemayor name had become synonymous with scandal. Ladies behind ornate fans whispered about the shocking revelation. A countess and a slave exchanging infants, a noble bloodline tainted. The story grew more sensational with each telling, embellished with details of forbidden romance, Yoruba curses, and divine retribution. "Have you heard?" they would murmur. "The Montemayor heir wasn't even of their blood. A slave woman's child raised in silk while the true heir toiled in the fields." After Father Esteban performed last rites for the fallen, the priest became a reluctant keeper of the plantation's dark secrets. He watched as the once prosperous estate fell into disrepair, its fields untended, its future uncertain. Across the Atlantic in Madrid, Carlos Rodrigo, no longer using the Montemayor name, had created a new identity for himself. The young man who had once enjoyed violin lessons and private tutors now lived modestly in a small apartment near the university district. His aristocratic mannerisms remained, but his purpose had transformed entirely. Carlos channeled his grief and rage into his writing, his quill moving furiously across parchment by candlelight. Under the pseudonym El Testigo, the witness, he published passionate tracts condemning the institution that had destroyed both his families. His anonymous pamphlets circulated among Spanish intellectuals, finding their way back to Cuba via sympathetic merchants and sailors. His words were incendiary, filled with first-hand accounts of the cruelties he had witnessed. "I have seen children torn from mothers," he wrote, "and brothers separated by nothing more than the accident of appearance. I have watched men of dignity broken under the lash, and women of courage silenced by fear. This is not civilization. It is its very opposite." In Havana's churches, prayers were offered for the souls of those lost at San Rafael. Yet even in these sacred spaces, the whispers continued. The scandal had shaken the colonial establishment to its core, forcing uncomfortable questions about bloodlines and birthrights that underpinned the entire social order. Meanwhile, in her isolated quarters near the abandoned plantation, Amara Okafor kept a small altar to both her sons, one lost to death, one to exile, maintaining the rituals that connected her to her Yoruba ancestors and to a future she still believed would come. From his modest apartment in Madrid, Carlos Rodrigo wrote feverishly by candlelight. His hands, once soft from privilege, now bore calluses from his relentless work. The pamphlets he produced under the pseudonym El Fantasma de San Rafael circulated throughout Spain's intellectual circles, finding their way into the hands of abolitionists and reformers who hungered for first-hand accounts of colonial cruelty. "The blood of brothers cries out from Cuban soil," he wrote, careful never to reveal his true identity. "A system that separates families and rewards deception cannot stand before God or history." These words, printed on thin paper and folded into tiny squares, made their way back to Cuba, hidden in sailors' boots, inside hollow books, and sewn into the linings of merchant coats. In Havana's taverns and Matanzas's hidden meeting places, people gathered in whispers to hear Carlos's manifesto read aloud. The former heir to San Rafael had transformed his pain into purpose. He formed connections with Spanish liberals and British abolitionists, channeling funds to support resistance movements throughout the Caribbean. His writings detailed not only the horrors of plantation life, but offered practical strategies for undermining the slave economy. The authorities placed a bounty on the mysterious ghost, never suspecting he was the disgraced son of one of their own. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Amara Akafair moved through her days with quiet determination. Though aging, the Yoruba healer commanded respect throughout the region. Plantation owners who once sought to punish her now feared her influence too much to touch her. She had become a living legend. On moonlit nights, she gathered the children of former slaves and free people of color, teaching them the stories of their ancestors. "Remember Tomas," she would say, "who carried the blood of two worlds and died fighting for freedom." She never revealed the full truth of his lineage, but kept alive the spirit of both her sons through stories that inspired courage. Father Esteban, now gray-haired but still devoted to his mission, brought her news of Carlos's work in Spain. "Your son moves mountains with his pen," he told her one evening, slipping her a tattered copy of the latest pamphlet. Amara traced the words with weathered fingers, unable to read them but feeling their power nonetheless. She had created a network of her own, women who passed messages, gathered information, and supported those planning escape. The priest helped where he could, providing sanctuary and medical care. "The Montemayor's are gone," Father Esteban observed, "but what you and your sons began continues to grow." Amara nodded, her eyes reflecting the flame of her small oil lamp. "Blood speaks to blood," she replied, "and truth, like water, always finds its way to the sea." The stone walls of Convento Santa Clara in Havana offered no sanctuary for Isabella de Montemayor. Her Spartan cell, with its single window overlooking the harbor, had become both refuge and prison. 18 years had passed since the tragedy at San Rafael, yet time had done nothing to quiet her conscience. Each night, Isabella would jolt awake, her nightgown damp with sweat, convinced she had heard Tomas calling for her. His face, so much like her own, haunted her dreams. The son she had surrendered to a life of suffering now visited her as a specter, his eyes asking the question she could never answer: why? By day, the former countess devoted herself to the convent's infirmary. Her hands, once adorned with jewels, now changed bandages and mixed herbal remedies. The sisters whispered about her dedication, how she would work until exhaustion claimed her, tending to the poorest of Havana's residents without complaint. "Penance is not measured in prayers, but in service," she would murmur when asked about her tireless efforts. In the quiet hours between Vespers and Compline, Isabella would sit at her small wooden desk, quill in hand, writing letters to Carlos in Madrid. Page after page filled with confessions, explanations, and pleas for understanding. She described the weight of aristocratic expectations, the fear that had driven her decision that stormy night, and her growing admiration for Amara's courage. "My son," she wrote in her elegant script, "I have come to understand that bloodlines mean nothing compared to the content of one's heart. Your true mother gave you life twice, once in birth and once in sacrifice." These letters, tied with simple twine, filled a cedar chest beneath her bed. Not one had been sent. Isabella knew Carlos had renounced the Montemayor name, taking on a new identity that she dared not disturb. Her health, always delicate, began to fail as the tropical heat of 49 consecutive summers took its toll. Yet even as her body weakened, Isabella's resolve strengthened. Working through trusted connections, a sympathetic merchant, a former lady's maid now married to a ship's captain, she arranged for her remaining dowry to be converted to pesos oro and channeled to abolitionists working in Matanzas. "The money comes with no conditions," she instructed in a rare meeting with Father Esteban, who had continued his quiet resistance. "Use it to purchase freedom, to establish schools, to help those who suffered under the Montemayor name. As Isabella knelt in prayer each evening, the rosary beads slipping through her fingers, she no longer asked for personal salvation. Instead, she prayed that her final act might bring some measure of justice to those whose lives had been shattered by her choices long ago, when a storm raged over San Rafael and two mothers made a pact that would destroy a dynasty. Long after the grand marble halls of San Rafael had crumbled into disrepair and the Montemayor name had faded from Matanzas society, Amara Aquifer remained. The years had weathered her face into a map of wisdom, each line telling stories of survival and quiet triumph. Unlike the dynasty she had once served, her legacy grew stronger with each passing season. By the mid-19th century, Amara had established herself as the keeper of memories in a community struggling to reconnect with its roots. Each evening, beneath a sprawling ceiba tree at the edge of what was once plantation land, she gathered the children of freedmen around her. Her voice, though softened by age, carried the power of generations as she taught them the songs that had crossed the ocean from Yorubaland. "Your ancestors were kings and queens," she would tell them, her eyes reflecting the same fire that had sustained her through decades of bondage. "Remember Tomas, who died so others might live in dignity." She never revealed that the martyr she spoke of with such reverence had carried aristocratic blood. Some truths were still too dangerous, too raw. The community revered her as both healer and historian. Former enslaved people from neighboring estates would travel for days to consult with her, bringing ailments of body and spirit. With herbs gathered under moonlight and prayers spoken in her mother tongue, Amara offered what the grand physicians of Havana could not: healing that honored the wholeness of a person. Father Esteban, now elderly himself, occasionally visited from his parish in Havana. "You've created something remarkable here," he once told her, watching as young men and women performed traditional dances that had once been forbidden. "A piece of Africa lives on through you." Amara merely nodded. "Not just Africa," she replied, "Cuba, as it should be." In her small wooden home, she kept three treasures: a scrap of fine linen from Carlos Rodrigo's swaddling cloth, a letter that had arrived from Madrid years earlier bearing news of his work, and a carved wooden figure that Tomas had made as a boy. These were her true legacy, proof that love could transcend the boundaries men created. When visitors asked how she had survived such tragedy, Amara would smile enigmatically. "I carried two sons in my heart," she would say. "One fought with his pen, one with his spirit. Both showed me that freedom begins in the mind long before it reaches the body." As twilight settled over the island each day, Amara would face westward toward Africa and whisper prayers for both her sons, the one who had died on Cuban soil and the one who fought for its soul from across an ocean. Through her teachings, the rhythms of bembe drums and the stories of orishas became woven into the very fabric of Cuban identity, a resilient thread of hope that would outlast empires. The ruins of San Rafael stood silent against the Cuban sky in 1851, 2 decades after the fateful night that had forever altered the course of two families. Weeds pushed through cracked marble floors where aristocrats once danced, and vines reclaimed the walls that had witnessed unspeakable suffering and an unimaginable pact. Carlos Rodrigo arrived under cover of darkness, no longer the privileged heir, but a weathered man whose writings on abolition had ignited debates across Spain and the Americas. He moved cautiously through the overgrown grounds, his heart heavy with memories of a childhood divided between two worlds. The former heir had spent years channeling his rage and grief into powerful pamphlets that exposed the brutality of the system that had claimed his brother's life. At the edge of what had once been the slave cemetery, Carlos knelt before an unmarked grave. "I've returned, brother," he whispered, placing his hand on the earth where Tomas had been laid to rest. The bond between them, forged in secret meetings by the river, in shared stories and dreams of freedom, had transcended blood and circumstance. From his coat, he withdrew a carefully wrapped manifesto, handwritten over many sleepless nights in Madrid. The document contained not just his personal testimony about the exchange that had defined their lives, but also detailed accounts of resistance across Cuba and a vision for a nation without chains. He buried it beneath a stone near the grave, a time capsule for future generations. In Havana, Amara Aquifer had become a revered elder among the growing community of freed people. Though her body had bent with age, the healer's spirit remained unbroken. Children and adults alike gathered to learn the Yoruba traditions she preserved, each song and ritual a testament to survival. She spoke often of her two sons, one by birth and one by heart, ensuring their stories would outlive the crumbling plantation. Isabella had died 3 years earlier in her convent cell, her final confession revealing the full extent of the pact she had made with Amara. The priest who heard it later remarked that in her last moments, the countess had found a peace that had eluded her in life. The Montemayor name had faded from society's lips. Their dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own deception. Yet throughout Matanzas province, stories persisted of the aristocrat and the healer who had dared to rewrite destiny. As Carlos departed Cuban shores for the last time, he gazed back at the island. The deadly pact of 1831 had destroyed a dynasty, but from its ashes had risen something far more enduring. A testament to the power of truth, the strength of maternal love, and the unbreakable spirit of those who fight for justice, even when justice seems impossible.